We're very excited to have Jeremy D'Entremont here with us tonight. I've put down in the chat section all of his, well, not all, but quite a bit of his information. He's a chairman of the Friends of the Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. He's a historian at the United States Lighthouse Society, and is the president of the American Lighthouse Foundation. I've also put down his website. He has many books that he's written. He has a podcast. Just go to the website. If you're a lighthouse person, you're going to love it. I've also put down information on the Friends of the Flying Santa. Some of you probably know what that's all about. Some of you might not. Back in 1929, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Yep, it started. And Santa would go by an old, was it a Piper Cub or something like that?
It started out with old amphibious planes. Piper Cubs,
okay,
I think, were used in there somewhere, but a lot of different aircraft are used over the years.
Yep, and they would go out to the lighthouse stations and drop toys for the children at Christmas time that lived with the children of the lighthouse keepers. It's carried on through today. Now they use a very fancy and sophisticated helicopter. They come to Scituate usually every year. I don't know what's going to happen this year with COVID and all that, but very exciting. It's a great foundation. And they are having a gala next week. I've put up the link to that. You can go in and hear all about the foundation, all about the history, and they donations to that organization are greatly appreciated. As we are, they are a nonprofit. Again, there is no fee for any of the programs that the society is offering to people. Donations are welcome and greatly appreciated. And I've got the PayPal link and the mailing address at the bottom. So I'm not going to talk anymore because I know you guys are here to listen to Jeremy and not to listen to me. So with that, Jeremy D'Entremont.
Thank you so much, Jean. Before I start the presentation, I just want to say thank you to the Scituate Historical Society for everything you and everybody at the Society has done for me over the years. And I want to single out Dave Ball. I was asking you about him a little while ago. For those who don't know, Dave's been president of the Historical, I don't know if he hasn't been president for those whole 35 years, has he? Has he been president for 35 years? Jean?
That I don't know. Martha's on there. She would know that.
Okay, well, that's okay. It doesn't matter. But he's been doing it for a long time, and he's just been a great help to me. So I want to mention, Dave and thank him. I don't think he's here, but I hope maybe he'll see this eventually. So starting out, I just want to say something pretty obvious. People love lighthouses. I think a lot of you here tonight love lighthouses. Maybe all of you, I hope. But it seems like wherever you go, there's an attraction to lighthouses, like a nostalgia about them. They have just tremendously wide appeal. And I would say that lighthouses are the most commonly used positive symbol or icon in our culture. They're used to symbolize hope and faith and guidance and steadfastness and just on and on, all kinds of positive qualities. And they're used by churches and schools and all kinds of businesses and so forth. But with that said, I like to say that lighthouses also have a dark side, slight pun intended there. And there seems to be something about a lighthouse, especially at night. You look out in the ocean and see that flashing light in the distance, excuse me, and it kind of sparks your imagination. I think people wonder, what was it like to be a keeper at a place like that? An isolated lighthouse way offshore, especially in the winter through storms and things like that. At least that's the kind of things I think about. But and there's kind of a dark quality to it. I just want to mention a couple of days ago, I was looking for music for my podcast, and I was on this music site where you can buy, pieces of music for things like that. And I put in the word lighthouse and did a search. And most of the stuff that came up was very dark music, like horror movie music. So I think a lot of people think of the dark side of lighthouses before they think of the light side. I have no doubt that some of the stories that I'm going to tell you tonight And some of the, in general, lighthouse ghost stories, some of them are the product of imagination and or exaggeration. If you were a lighthouse keeper like I said, in an isolated lighthouse in the winter, you'd maybe be out there in a storm, maybe hear the wind getting in the cracks of the windows and whistling inside the tower. And I'm hearing a ghost, I think, but or you might hear the different materials, the cast iron, if it was an iron lighthouse or whatever, things expanding and contracting as the temperature changed, just all kinds of things that could make noises in the night. And if you were, out in the middle of nowhere, your imagination could play tricks on you. And also, I'm sure there was some exaggeration. Stories are passed around, stories are passed down through generations, and we all know how they get stretched all out of recognition. So the story that is passed down is not necessarily the story, as it originally started, if there was some truth in it in the first place. But with all that said, I want to say that I believe that some of these stories have a lot of basis in fact. I like to call myself an open-minded skeptic. I think it's healthy to be skeptical. I don't think we should automatically accept everything that's told to us. I believe in science, but I also I believe it's important to be open-minded. I don't think we understand everything about this world. And I have to say that I have actually experienced some things myself that I'm going to talk about tonight that are a little out of the ordinary. And I've talked to many people who've experienced strange things. And I have to have an open mind because I don't think those people are crazy. And I like to think that I'm not crazy myself. So I think there's something to at least some of these stories, or there's something going on that's interesting. And, sometimes I talk to ex-lighthouse keepers or family members of lighthouse keepers, and they'll tell me ghost stories. I don't ask them for them. For instance, I was talking a few years ago to a guy who had been a Coast Guard lightkeeper at some lighthouses in Maine. We're about to hang up, and he started laughing, and he said, some people think these places are haunted. And I thought, well, he doesn't believe in it. But then he said, he stopped laughing, and he said, but one time I was at Libby Island Lighthouse, which is way up the coast near Jonesport, Maine. And he said he went out at night near the keeper's house, and he's looking over at the lighthouse tower, and he was absolutely sure he saw a woman sitting on the railing at the top of the lighthouse with her legs dangling down. And that was really weird because there was no woman on the island. And also a person doesn't normally sit on that railing, if you know what I'm talking about. So it was very odd, and he looked at her for a little bit. I don't think much time passed, but then she disappeared. And he told me he is absolutely sure to this day that he saw a woman there. So he kind of laughed about the idea of ghosts, but then he told me a ghost story. And I've heard other similar stories from other ex-lighthouse keepers. I just got something by email yesterday, by the way, from somebody who's working on a book on a lighthouse in Alaska. So if I could sneak that in at the very end, maybe I can fit that in too. And the dark side of lighthouses has certainly appealed to a lot of writers and filmmakers over the years. Here are some covers of books and comic books and so forth that have utilized lighthouses. The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury, a great science fiction writer, on the upper left, was the basis of the 50s science fiction movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And in that movie, there's a scene where the sea monster destroys the lighthouse with a couple of keepers in it. It's a great scene. I love it. And you see Storm of the Century, Stephen King's book, was made into a mini-series. A lighthouse figured prominently in that. And I also want to mention, it's not real well known, but our greatest writer of horror fiction, Edgar Allan Poe, was actually working on a story about a lighthouse keeper when he died at the age of 40. And they found notes in his notebook, and he was writing about a keeper off the coast of England at an isolated lighthouse in the late 1700s. And this man actually was seeking solitude, so he got the job as a lighthouse keeper. But after some time passes, he starts noticing strange things going on. He basically starts going mad. He hears voices and maybe people outside the lighthouse, even though it's out in the middle of the ocean. And we'll never know what Poe had in mind because he died before he wrote much of the story. but an editor named Christopher Conlon put together this book that you see here, Poe's Lighthouse. He got together a lot of science fiction and horror writers from all over. They all took Poe's notes as a basis and wrote their own version of the story. So it's a really interesting book. I liked it a lot. But I will warn you, if you find it's out of print, but you can maybe find a used copy. But if you do, just be warned that at least one of the chapters is X-rated. So I just want to warn you, but most of it is not that way, but it's a fun book. Again, the dark side of Lighthouses has been utilized in a number of movies, and sprinkled through the presentation tonight, I'm going to play you a few film clips. Some of you might remember the David O. Selznick production Portrait of Jenny from 1948, starring Joseph Cotton and Jennifer Jones. It has some supernatural elements in it, and part of it was shot at Graves Lighthouse in outer Boston Harbor. And I'm going to play you a clip from late in the movie here. You're going to see Joseph Cotton calling to his lost love, Jenny, at Graves Light. It's a little hard to gauge how loud the sound should be. I hope I didn't blow people's eardrums out with that. So I'm going to get into the stories of knowing the lighthouses that I want to tell you tonight now. And I'm going to start with the first lighthouse on the North American continent, Boston Light. And this is a drawing of the first lighthouse there. And of course, it's not too far from Scituate, so I know many of you are familiar with Boston Light. And the original lighthouse went into service September 14, 1716, 50-foot stone tower lit by candles at first. And the very first man hired to be the first keeper on the continent was George Worthylake. He was 43 years old, had a farm on Lovell's Island in the harbor. And he and his wife and two daughters went to live on the island, Little Brewster Island it's called. It's actually much closer to the town of Hull than it is to Boston. And most of the shipping traffic passed for many years between Hull and Boston Light. Anyway, so Worthylake, his wife and two daughters went to live on the island along with a family servant and two slaves. There was a male slave named Shadwell and a female slave named Dinah. And Worthylake was paid very little, so he had to do extra things to make money. And one of the things he did was he was a harbor pilot for vessels coming into the harbor. He tried having a flock of sheep. That didn't work out because his 59 sheep wandered out onto a sand spit at low tide. The tide came in, and that was the end of his flock of sheep. But in November 1718, Worthylake went into Boston to pick up his pay. Actually, they went in on a Sunday. He went with his wife and one of their daughters and the family servant on a Sunday. They attended church, stayed overnight. The next morning, he picked up his pay, and they were traveling back to Boston Light in a sloop, similar to the vessel you see here. They picked up a family friend at Lovell's Island, and then they anchored off of Boston Light. And Shadwell, the slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party, while the Worthylake's other daughter and a friend were watching from the island. There was not a storm, there were not especially big waves or anything. But for some reason, as the canoe was being paddled back to the island, the canoe capsized and all 6 people in the canoe drowned. It was probably just overloaded. We don't know absolutely for sure why it happened, but the water was cold. We probably didn't know how to swim very well. In any case, this is still the worst lighthouse tragedy in terms of deaths in American history. And there's the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake in the Cops Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. Excuse me, it's got those spooky old death's heads they used to use. And interestingly, the young man who carved this gravestone subsequently married the Worthylake's surviving daughter. So I guess something good came out of it. Cotton Mather, the minister in Boston, preached a sermon about it. young Ben Franklin, who was 12 years old at the time and living in Boston, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy, and his older brother printed copies, and Ben Franklin sold copies on the streets of Boston of The Lighthouse Tragedy. Interestingly, the second keeper, Robert Saunders, who went out to replace Worthy Lake, also drowned a few days later, along with a friend, when their boat capsized. So people started to think the island was cursed. Excuse me. I'm jumping ahead about, let's see, 1718 to the late 1940s. I don't have time to figure out how many years that is, over 200 years. But this is actually a late 19th century picture of Boston Light, and that particular keeper's house was demolished. It's not there anymore. But anyway, in the late 1940s, there was a woman named Maisie Anderson. She had grown up at Lighthouses in Maine. Her father was a keeper. She married a Coast Guardsman, and her husband, Russell Anderson, became a keeper at Boston Light in the late 40s. So she wrote an article for Yankee magazine years later about her life at lighthouses. She said that at Boston Light, after they moved in there, she started hearing a girl sobbing at night. You know, she'd be trying to sleep and she would hear this girl's sobbing, which was really weird because there was no girl on the island. And I believe it was on more than one occasion, she heard the girl repeating Shadwell, Shadwell over and over. And Maisie had no idea what that meant. Excuse me. Also, she said that on more than one occasion, she heard what she described as a man's maniacal laugh coming from the boathouse. And I can't tell you what that was about. But anyway, years later, she was doing some research on the history of Boston Light, and she discovered that the slave who died in that accident in 1718, along with the Worthy Lakes, was named Shadwell. And that's what she had heard that girl shouting out when she would hear that at night. So it was Maisie Anderson's assumption that what she had heard was like a replaying of that event kind of over and over, and hearing the daughter of George Worthy Lake calling out for the slave Shadwell. Skipping to the late 1980s, the Coast Guard was going to automate the light. Dennis Dever was a Coast Guard keeper in the late 80s. Everybody thought he was going to be the last lighthouse keeper in America. I got to know him pretty well because I was helping to give tours at Boston Light at that time. I interviewed Dennis at the top of the lighthouse in the summer of '89. I'll play you a brief clip here.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window. Just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
Dennis loved a good ghost story. He loved being a lighthouse keeper. Excuse me. And he loved a good ghost story, loved being out there in a storm. And he told me a few ghost stories. One thing he told me was that when he would be working in the boathouse that you see here, he would have the radio on. He would have it on a rock station. And mysteriously, the radio would change to a classical station. So he would change it back, and he had like a running battle with the radio. He also said that one time he was at the sink in the keeper's house doing the dishes, and the window in the kitchen looked out towards the lighthouse, and he's looking out, and he was sure he saw a man standing in the lantern at the top of the lighthouse. And he checked the next room, and the only other guy on the island was right there. So he couldn't figure it out. So Dennis ran over to the lighthouse and ran up the stairs, and there was nobody there. And he told me he had no doubt that he saw somebody standing up there, I should say, and that it was somebody wearing an old-fashioned uniform, like an old-fashioned keeper's uniform. So weird things happened there fairly often, and the different Coast Guard keepers I talked to over the years would always blame it on old George, meaning George Worthy Lake, that first keeper. As it turned out, Dennis wasn't the last keeper at Boston Light because legislation was passed to keep a presence there. And there were Coast Guard keepers for a while longer, but then about 17 years ago, they hired Sally Snowman to be keeper, a civilian, and she's still keeper today. She is the only official lighthouse keeper in the United States still employed by the federal government. She's by the second order Fresnel lens at Boston Light there, the top picture. And she wears those colonial style dresses, likes to wave a hanky at passing ships. Anyway, she told me some stories. She supervises Coast Guard auxiliary watchstanders. They're volunteers who spend time out there. She told me that a number of them told her stories. One thing was that they would see a woman standing at the top of the lighthouse in the evening, looking out to sea with long flowing hair and a flowing white nightgown, kind of a cliche ghost, I'm sorry to say, but that doesn't mean it's not true. But they would also see a woman walking on the paths on the island at night when there was nobody there. And one story I really liked was that one of these people was sleeping on the couch in the living room, and it was there was a rainstorm going on, and the cellar would flood when it would rain pretty often. So this person was getting up periodically and checking for water leaking into the basement. And one time they stood up, and there's the stairway to the second floor is pretty close to the couch. And they look at the stairs, and there was a woman coming down the stairs. And this person's eyes and the woman on the stairs' eyes met for a few seconds. And then he said she disappeared. That was a little unsettling. A couple of years ago, I spent a night on the couch at Boston Light, and the strangest thing that happened to me was just hearing gulls squawking all night. I didn't see anything that interesting, but I have to say I was very aware of that stairway. All right, I'm going to jump down to southern New England here. This is one of my favorite lighthouses. Architecturally, I think it's one of the most beautiful lighthouses in this country, if not the world. Built in 1909, it's at the mouth of the Thames River. That's how they pronounce it there, Thames, between New London and Groton, Connecticut. And it's just this beautiful brick mansion with a mansard roof. I think it's very beautiful. They say it was built that way to be in keeping with the beautiful homes on shore. This lighthouse has probably the most famous ghost story of any lighthouse in New England, and one of the most famous in the country. And the ghost is usually referred to as Ernie. And I'm going to tell you the story that's behind the ghost here. And I'm not guaranteeing that this is a true story, but I'm going to tell it to you the way it's usually told. They say that in the 1930s, and that's an important part of the story, is they say, okay? They say in the 1930s, there was a keeper at this lighthouse named Ernie. And he was there with his wife, and his wife became very bored. And one day, Ernie went off to get some supplies, was away from the lighthouse for a while. And he came back, and he found a note from his wife. And the note said that she had run away with the captain of the Block Island Ferry, which goes by there all the time. So poor Ernie was distraught, and he went to the roof of the lighthouse and dove off to his death. That's the way it's usually told, although some versions say that he drank himself stupid and fell off the roof to his death. But usually they say he did it on purpose and left a note behind saying that he would haunt the place because of what his wife did to him. Supposedly, here's an old postcard of it. Supposedly, over the years, a lot of people have experienced very weird things there. The Coast Guard in the especially I've seen some articles from the 1970s. It was automated well into the 1980s. It was one of the last lighthouses to be automated. And they say that the Coast Guard keepers would see their TV turn on and off for no apparent reason. The light itself would turn on and off for no reason. The foghorn would do the same thing. One of the things in an article about it that's little far-fetched said that the decks would swab themselves. Not quite sure how that worked, but just on and on. The Coast Guard guys would say that their furniture would rearrange itself. So some of it's just a little hard to believe, but in any case, it got a reputation as a very haunted lighthouse. And the story of Ernie became quite famous. In more recent years, a lot of different paranormal research groups have spent time there, including the Ghost Hunters TV show some years ago. They didn't find anything, but a group called Most Haunted, a TV show called Most Haunted with a group of English ghost hunters, had some stuff happen there, including lights turning on and off for no reason. I believe you can still see that on YouTube if you search for Most Haunted, the London Lighthouse. And I got to spend a night out there in July 2006. And I went with a few people from New England Ghost Project. And it was shot as an episode of a TV show called American Builder. And American Builder used to be produced by Comcast. It was on every day. It was like a home improvement show, but they were doing a Halloween special on this haunted lighthouse. So let me tell you about New England Ghost Project. Ron Kolek, you don't see him real well here. I'm going to show you another picture of him in a minute. But that's him on the right. On the left picture, he's got the like tan hat on. And well, you can't really see him on the other picture. But the woman who, well, I didn't finish my thought there. Ron Kolek started New England Ghost Project. He's the lead investigator. He's written a couple of books on the paranormal. He's got a couple of radio shows and so forth. Maureen Wood is the woman with the blonde hair you see in both pictures. She is the trance medium of New England Ghost Project. And, you know, I'm not asking anybody to believe any of this, but the idea is that she channels spirits. They speak through her. And I will tell you that I have been present for a number of investigations with Maureen, and a number of times there's been no easy explanation for the things she comes up with, which are really, really interesting. And I'm going to tell you a story at the end tonight that is especially interesting. So, you know, she's just an average soccer mom kind of person, very down to earth. Doesn't seem like there's anything extraordinary about her except that she communicates with spirits. But anyway, the other woman is Karen Mossy, who is at that time was the EVP expert of New England Ghost Project. I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. And the guy with the maroon baseball cap was Jimmy, one of the hosts of American Builder, who was out there with us. So early in the night, they played with the Ouija board a little bit, but not much was happening with that. So a bunch of them, I was not part of this. I was watching, but several of these people sat on the floor holding hands, and Maureen started apparently channeling. And she said, well, she didn't say anything about it. All of a sudden, she just started speaking as if she was a different person. Her voice seemed quite deep. And she looked at Ron and she said, "You lie." And, you know, she looked really, really angry at him. And she started holding her head and moaning, oh, holding her head. And she kind of fell backwards like something really horrible was happening. I mean, she was sitting down, but she kind of rolled backwards and looked like she was flailing, like in pain, and something terrible was happening. So Ron kind of helped her snap out of it, and she was fine. But the bottom line is that this is in the morning. Ron and Maureen were waiting for a boat ride back. It was completely foggy out, and we were waiting for the boat. Kind of appropriate that we woke up in the fog. I didn't say we woke up because we never went to sleep. Anyway, from what she experienced, Maureen came to the conclusion that there's an angry male spirit there, and she said this guy was not a lighthouse keeper. She said that he was a construction worker and he was part of a crew working there, possibly involved in building the lighthouse in the first place, and that his co-workers locked him out on the roof as a prank, and that he slipped and fell to his death trying to get back in. And she believes that his co-workers covered up his death, or covered up, you know, what happened, and he's very angry about that. And possibly also angry because everybody has the story wrong. Everybody thinks it's a lighthouse keeper there. Anyway, it's an interesting alternate version of the story because there's no record of a keeper named Ernie. There's no record of a keeper committing suicide or anything like that there. So I don't think the Ernie story is true. I think what happened is that it was made up by Coast Guard people maybe in the 1960s or 70s, because there's no record of anything like that before that. It's possible that they experienced weird things and somebody made up the story as sort of an explanation, like a backstory for it. But Maureen's story makes more sense. It's more believable. Is it true? I have no idea, but it's an interesting alternate version. There's the lighthouse in the fog when we were leaving. So I mentioned EVPs earlier. Karen Mossy is considered one of the experts on this. It stands for electronic voice phenomena. And it goes way back to the early days of recording. The idea is that you can use a recorder and, you know, let it record for a while somewhere. And even though no sound is heard audibly, sometimes you play back a recording and you'll hear voices on it. And a lot of people believe these are voices of the dead or voices of spirits. And some researchers will ask questions into the recorder. Usually these days they use little digital recorders. They'll ask questions, and sometimes when you play it back, you hear answers to the questions. So, and there are classes of EVPs, A, B, C, D, depending on how clear they are. So this first one, you're going to hear Karen's voice in the lighthouse very late at night. I think it was around midnight or so, saying, are you here, yes or no? And she seems to get a response to that. Whoops. Let me try that again.
Are you here, yes or no?
Turn it up a little more. Let me play that one again.
Are you here, yes or no?
I hope you could hear that. It's kind of fuzzy, but it sounds like a pretty distinct yes to me. This one was recorded by Karen at the top of the stairs on the deck there. I think it was about 2 a.m. And she believes that it's saying, help me, I'm cold. It's not super clear, and it's kind of a raspy voice. It's weird in any case, but let me play it for you. I'll play it again. I think the I'm cold part is more clear, but, and they're open to interpretation. You know, Karen thought it was saying, help me, I'm cold, but, you know, it's definitely open to interpretation. This one, you're going to hear Ron Kolick's voice, again, somewhere in the middle of the night, inside the lighthouse saying, do you like us here? And he gets a response.
Do you like us here?
Sounds like a whispery yes. If this spirit liked us being there, it wasn't the same one that Maureen was channeling, because that one was very angry. It didn't seem happy about anything.
Do you like us here?
And there's Ernie himself, keeping guard inside the lighthouse there. All right, I'm going to play another film clip here. This is a 1959 movie called The Monster of Piedras Blancas. Not exactly a ghost movie, but certainly uses the dark side of lighthouses. Even though it's supposed to be set at the Piedras Blancas lighthouse in California, it was actually shot at the Point Conception lighthouse. They're not that far from each other. The monster is kind of like the creature from the Black Lagoon. I actually interviewed one of the stars on the phone, Jeannie Carmen, starlet at the time. But anyway, I'm going to play you a real quick clip here from it. You can probably guess what happens to the lighthouse keeper right after that, but you have to see it for yourself. It's that's kind of a fun, cheesy movie. All right. Moving on here, Penfield Reef Lighthouse, also down in Connecticut, farther west on Long Island Sound, near Fairfield, Connecticut. It's actually off of what they call Penfield Beach, and a beautiful lighthouse. I love the architecture here too, and there are a few other lighthouses that look kind of like it, but it's unique in some ways. It's now privately owned, by the way. It's still an active light. But this has another, what I think is a really compelling ghost story, because in this case, it's based on a true story, or it seems to have its origins in a true story. There's an old postcard of it. On the right, I'm not sure who the man on the left in that picture is, but the other man on the right there is Rudolph Eiten, I-T-E-N. And he was, at the time of the incident I'm going to tell you about, 1916, he was the assistant keeper at Penfield Reef. The head keeper was a man named Fred Jordan. I don't have any pictures of him. And December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, Fred Jordan was going to shore in one of the station's two sailboats to bring presents to his family for Christmas. He had handmade wooden presents he had prepared. So as he's doing that, as he's crossing to the mainland, a big squall came in, and suddenly the seas got extremely rough, and Eiten was watching from the lighthouse, and he saw Jordan struggling, saw the boat looking like it could capsize. So Eiten was trying to launch the other boat, but he couldn't because it was too windy. And he watched as Jordan kind of just disappeared into the waves, into the ocean. So Jordan's body was later found. Nobody blamed Eiten for it, and he became the next head keeper. He had some interesting experiences after that. Here's an old picture of the lighthouse, the foghorn protruding from the front. Iten said in a newspaper article years later that one night he was in his room and he saw a figure. He described it as a gray phosphorescent figure cross by his doorway and enter into the room that had been Fred Jordan's room. And he got up to investigate, and he found the logbook, the Lighthouses logbook, open to the day that Fred Jordan had died. And the another interesting thing about that is that on the day Jordan died, Iten didn't finish the entry. I think he never couldn't bring himself to put in the entry about Jordan dying. So it was kind of unfinished for that day. And when they found Jordan's body, he actually had a note in his pocket reminding Iten to finish the journal entry. And then again that night, when Iten went into that room, the journal that had been on a shelf was open on a table to that day. So it's all pretty interesting. And he also said that the assistant keepers had experienced the same thing, and that they would all sign an affidavit saying that they had seen it. Now, Iten and Jordan were friends. I don't think Iten would have joked about this. I don't think he would have made it up. So to me, it's actually one of the most interesting stories. And they say that years later, there were a lot of weird experiences there. The Coast Guard keepers, similar to New London Ledge, they'd say that the light and foghorn behaved erratically, but also supposedly passing boaters would see a male figure at the top of the lighthouse or on the rocks, long after it was automated and nobody was living there. And supposedly 2 boys were boating or fishing in a small boat nearby, and their boat capsized and they were in the water. And they said that some man kind of grabbed them and dragged them ashore and saved them. And they were almost unconscious, but when they came to, they looked for the man to thank him, but there was no man there or in the lighthouse or anywhere around, so they never figured that out. So I guess he's a helpful ghost. Jumping up to Maine now. This is Owl's Head Light in Mid-Coast, Maine, near Rockland, at the entrance to Rockland Harbor on Penobscot Bay. Beautiful light station there. A short 25-foot brick lighthouse, but 100 feet above the water because it's a high bluff. And there's an aerial picture with the keeper's house and the stairs and the walkway and stairs going up to the lighthouse, the oil house off to the right there. And the man on the picture is George Woodward, who was a keeper in the World War II era. I'm just showing him as an example of a keeper at this lighthouse, because some of the stories there seem to point to a former keeper possibly still keeping watch there, a former deceased keeper still keeping watch. Nobody has, there's no story like an Ernie story or anything to explain it. Nobody's given him a name. So if that's the case, we don't know who it is. On the left, the man in the dark pants and the khaki shirt there is Malcolm Rouse, or Mac. And he was the last Coast Guard keeper at Owl's Head before it was automated in 1989. Believe it or not, the other guy there is me, a little over 30 years ago, and I don't think I've changed a bit. If anything, I look younger. But anyway, so I visited Mac and I interviewed him at that time, just before the place was automated. And he was the first person to tell me Owl's Head Light Station is haunted. He said that his wife, on repeated occasions, would see a figure. She described it as an outline of somebody who seemed to be dressed in white in one of the windows. When she'd be outside, she'd see it. And their son would see a woman sitting in a chair in his room, and he was very insistent about it, that he kept seeing this woman there. And Mac, I don't think he was real specific with me, but I think he had some odd experiences too. But one of the things you keep hearing about Owl's Head that's pretty famous is that the keepers there would get up in the morning after it had snowed, and they look outside and there'd be footprints in the snow going up the walkway and stairs right to the lighthouse door, but wouldn't go anywhere from there. They didn't seem to start anywhere on the grounds. They just appeared on the walkway, so it didn't seem to make much sense at all. Later, I met an earlier keeper, John Norton, who was there around 1980, And he told me that he was up in his bedroom on the second floor one night, and he told me he was absolutely sure he was awake. He wasn't even close to sleeping. And he saw what he describes as an old man's face hovering above him and looking right at him. And he absolutely insisted that he saw that. It wasn't something he imagined. After John Norton, there was a couple there named Andy and Denise German, Germann, and they had a few interesting experiences, but the most interesting one was one night when they were going to bed, but Andy realized he had to do some stuff outside, so he left Denise in the bed, and Denise is falling asleep, but suddenly she became aware that seemed to be somebody moving around in the bed next to her, and she looked and she said that she saw the indentation of a person moving around, but nobody was there. Not too much of this really creeps me out, but that kind of does. But anyway, so Andy came back after a while and they talked about it the next day. And Andy said, well, when I left the room, I saw what looked like a cloud of smoke enter the bedroom from the hallway. And I don't know why he didn't tell her about it at the time, but the timing of it seemed to coincide with what she experienced. So that was really interesting. So when the Germans were leaving, Al said the next family to come there was the Grahams, and that is them on the right, Gerard Graham and his wife Debbie and their little daughter Claire. They're standing by the fourth order Fresnel lens at Alced Lighthouse. And the Germans told them the place was haunted. And they said, especially this one upstairs bedroom, they said, you don't want to use that room. It's the most haunted part of the house. The Grahams laughed. They thought that was hilarious. And they made that their daughter Claire's bedroom. So the entire couple of years they lived there, turns out that Claire had an imaginary friend who she described as an old sea captain. And one night, Gerard and Debbie were sound asleep. And late at night, little Claire, 3 years old at the time, wanders into the bedroom. And she said, wake up, time to put the fog's rolling in. Let me try that again. Wake up, the fog's rolling in, time to put the horn on. And they had no idea where she got that because they had never talked about anything like that with her. So they figured it must have been the old sea captain who told her. Alced Light was featured in a Travel Channel documentary, Haunted Lighthouses of America, about 2002. And I'm in that documentary. I was interviewed for it. I also got to play the lighthouse ghost in a couple of scenes, although that's not me in the uniform here. That is the father-in-law of the officer, Coast Guard officer who was living in the keeper's house at that time. So that was fun being part of that show. It was shown on the Travel Channel many times, but they don't seem to be showing it anymore. And this picture was taken a few years ago, must be at least 5 or 6 years ago now, by Bob D'Amato, who lives in Connecticut. And he told me all the circumstances behind it. He was there about 11 at night with a friend. His friend was standing behind him when he took this picture. And it's a long exposure. I forget how many seconds, but at least several seconds. You can see the blur of the flag on the flagpole there showing you that it's a longer exposure. So that's looking down the stairs from the lighthouse, the oil house there, directly down the stairs. And the interesting part of this picture, and it was, I should mention his friend was behind him. There was nobody else around at all. Again, about 11 at night. And the interesting part of the picture is right here to the right of the flagpole. And I'll show you what it looks like when you zoom in and crop that right there. And I don't have any explanation for this. I showed this to photography experts who have no good explanation for it. I'm sure it wasn't photoshopped. I've gotten to know Bob D'Amato. I had dinner with him one time, and he was quite surprised at what he had. I really don't believe it was faked in any way. It sure looks like the outline of a man standing there. At least I think it looks like a man. Now that I'm looking at it again, I suppose it could be a woman. But anyway, it looks like a person, and you can see right through it, obviously. So to me, this is one of the most interesting pictures I've ever seen taken at a lighthouse along these lines. Here's another film clip for you. This movie, Tormented, also has some supernatural elements in it. It involves a sort of a murder, as I'm about to show you. And some of it was shot at the Point Conception Lighthouse again in California. But this, where they're standing there, is obviously a set made to look like a lighthouse. Almost looks like somebody's porch screen door and back over there. But anyway, let me play you this clip. Oops.
Darling, you look as if you were ready to kill me.
Now you get this straight. I'm marrying Meg.
And you get this straight, Tom Stewart. No one will ever have you but me. Help me! Please, Tom, help me! Take my hand! Pull me out! Save me, Tom, please! Please save me! Please!
So this and Monster of the Piedras Blancas make a good cheesy double feature of Dark Side of Lighthouse movies. So a little bit further down the Maine coast, this is Seguin Light, and it's at the mouth of the Kennebec River near Boothbay Harbor and Bath, at the approach to the city of Bath, which is a shipbuilding center. And it's a very high island. It's the highest light in any lighthouse in the state of Maine, about 200 feet above the water. It's got a first order lens. It's about 9 feet tall, and the only first order lens still in use in northern New England. So I could talk about its history a lot, but I want to tell you, it's got another one of the most famous ghost stories of any lighthouse. It's another one of these they say kinds of stories. Here's a picture of the lighthouse from the water. You can see why Champlain said it looked like a tortoise. Tourists visit it, but it looks like a tortoise. Anyway, I'll tell you the ghost story as it's usually told. They say that in the mid-1800s, there was a keeper there. Nobody seems to know his name, but that this keeper, again, had a wife who became very bored. That seems to be a common theme. And the keeper's wife asked for a piano. So the keeper bought his wife a piano, and it was brought out there on a vessel and carried up the steep slope to the keeper's house and put in place in the house. But along with the piano, the woman was given only one piece of sheet music, some popular song of the day. She quickly learns how to play it. She would play that song over and over and over and over and over and over. You get the idea. To the point that it drove her husband insane. And he grabbed the axe they had for chopping firewood, proceeded to chop up the piano, proceeded to murder his wife and kill himself. So the story goes. And they say that ever since then, there's a lot of weird stuff at Seguin, but the most common thing is that supposedly if you're there on a quiet day or night, listen carefully, you're going to hear that soft, pretty piano music playing in the breeze. You'll hear that same song playing over and over and over again. Now, I don't think that's a true story. There's no record of any murder-suicide there at all. There would be if something like that happened. But I know a woman who was there. This is about 15 years ago. I was on a Coast Guard boat with her. She said that just a few days before that, she had been on Seguin. She had never heard the ghost story or anything about the piano or anything like that. So she's walking around by herself and she heard this soft, pretty piano music. And she described it as sounding like a memory, which is an interesting way to describe music. And she thought, oh, that's really pretty. She went to the caretaker and said, music was beautiful. Who was playing the piano? And he said, there's no piano here. Nobody was playing any music. So you must have heard the ghost. And she told me she knew that she had heard this pretty piano music. They say that, even people passing in boats and so forth sometimes hear it. Some people say that the murder-suicide really happened, but it happened at a different island near there and somehow got transferred to the lighthouse. So who knows? Maybe there's some basis in fact there. Some people have written versions of the story where they give the names of the people and the name of the song and everything, but I think that's embellishment. There's no basis for any of that. Coming further down the coast in Kennebunkport, the Cape Porpoise section of Kennebunkport. This is Goat Island Lighthouse, just a short brick tower, built in 1859. And it's this property is managed by the Kennebunkport Conservation Trust, nonprofit that manages a lot of land around there. And they do a great job with it. There's an early postcard of it, early 1900s. The man on the upper left is a friend of mine I've known for a long time, since I'd say around 1996. That's Scott Dombrowski. And he's the longtime caretaker. He and his wife and 2 sons used to live on the island in summers. He doesn't live out there full time in the summer anymore, but he's there a lot. And he's from Marblehead, Massachusetts. And growing up in Marblehead, Mass, a childhood friend of his was the guy on the right, Dick Curtis. So they grew up together, and then they both moved to Kennebunkport, and Dick became the winter caretaker of the lighthouse. And Dick was a lobsterman out of Kennebunkport, out of Cape Porpoise, and they remained good friends. So Dick was the winter caretaker for a few years, lived out there with a couple of dogs. He was a single guy. On Memorial Day weekend of 2002, I believe it was on Memorial Day, Dick was on shore, and he was talking to somebody on shore, and he said he was going to take a boat ride out around the island, and he was going to have 3 dogs with him. So he left, and people realized by the next day that he never came back. So a search party went out. Eventually his boat was found overturned, and eventually his body was found. Nobody's sure what happened. They think that maybe his dogs got in trouble and he tried to save them. The boat capsized, and he was probably wearing a lot of clothes, and he just didn't make it. And one of the dogs made it back, by the way. 2 of them didn't. But they had a big memorial service for him. He was a very popular guy. Not too long after that, maybe a year or 2 after that, I visited Goat Island, and I was up on the top of the lighthouse with Scott, and he said to me, Dick and I used to joke that after we die, we'll haunt this place. And Scott has had so many experiences there that seem to point to Dick still being there. And I'll tell you one of the most interesting. This happened in 2005. And I should preface this by saying, I'm not sure if this happened in 2005, but I think a little bit before that. A woman visited the island, and Scott didn't know anything about her, didn't know who she was or anything. But she introduced herself to Scott, and she said she picked up on some things on the island. She said that there was a spirit there. And she said something like, out of the blue, said to Scott, "Your friend will make himself known by electronic means." So in 2005, and I should back up again and remind people, if you don't know, that the Bush family compound, Walker's Point, is right near there in the Cape Porpoise part of Kennebunkport, where George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush lived for many years. In fact, the Secret Service lived at Goat Island for a while during his presidency. So in 2005, George W. Bush, while he was president, was visiting with his parents, and President Putin from Russia came to visit for a meeting with George W. Bush. And Scott knew this was happening, so he put up a Russian flag next to the American flag at the lighthouse. I think that's bad flag etiquette, but he was trying to say that America and Russians should work together. So one afternoon, both Presidents Bush, George H.W. and George W. Bush, and Putin all came out in a boat, and Scott could clearly see all of them. He was standing at the top of the lighthouse by himself, and he was standing right near the electronic foghorn, and he saw them in the boat, and looking at his flag and everything, and I think they waved. And Scott was quite excited about that. And he said, "How do you like that, Dick?" Meaning his friend who had died. And the second Scott said that, the foghorn started blowing. "How do you like that, Dick?" Wah, wah. And Scott said it wouldn't stop. He called the Coast Guard. They couldn't turn it off. And it never worked right again until a couple of years later, until they replaced all the equipment. So, to him, that was one of many things that happened that seemed to prove that Dick's presence was there. Come down to the Scituate area, I threw in a couple of extra lighthouses here because I am speaking, of course, for the Scituate Historical Society. I know there's people from other parts of the country as well, but a lot of you are from Scituate and the surrounding area. This, of course, is Minot's ledge light. Anybody living in Scituate knows it. It's a mile or so offshore from the nearest point of land, and kind of near the border between Scituate and Cohasset. I won't say which town it's in case there's Cohasset people here too. But anyway, it's a famous lighthouse. It's about 114 feet tall, made of granite. It's on a ledge that's only visible at low tide, and it's really one of the most famous so-called wave-swept lighthouses in the world. But I want to tell you about what happened with the first lighthouse there. Here's a drawing of the first lighthouse that was went into service in 1850. And the government didn't put up enough money for a lighthouse here. You know, there had been many shipwrecks there, and they knew they needed a lighthouse, but at that time we were just trying to save money. So they spent way too little money, and the designer came up with this idea, which was a 70-foot spindly kind of structure on iron piles that were driven into the rock with a 2-floor apartment at the top for the keepers. The first keeper, Isaac Dunham, complained that in storms, the lighthouse would sway back and forth 2 feet in each direction. He wrote in the keeper's log during one storm that the light was reeling like a drunken man. And after about 10 months, he and his son, who was an assistant, and another assistant keeper all quit all at the same time. So the next keeper was John Bennett, who had been in the Royal Navy in England. He was confident about it at first, but then he was there for a storm or two and he changed his mind. The government put more braces on the legs, but it really wasn't enough. In early April 1851, there was a big storm that washed away one of the station's boats. I shouldn't say one of the station's boats, it was the only boat. It washed away the boat. So Bennett had to go into Boston to get a new boat, and he left 2 young assistant keepers in charge of the lighthouse. They were both in their 20s, Joseph Antoine, who was from Portugal, and Joseph Wilson, who was from England. And while Bennett was away on shore, another storm came into the Boston area, and this one was worse than the previous one. Houses were washed off the Boston waterfront and the islands, and the Boston waterfront area was all flooded. And on the night of the storm, April 16th, people on shore could see the flash of the lighthouse in the distance. And after midnight, they heard the frantic ringing of the fog bell at one point. And then there was no sound and there was no light. Early in the morning, Bennett went to shore and saw pieces of the lighthouse washing up, some articles of his own clothing coming up on shore, and he knew what had happened. Sadly, the bodies of those 2 young keepers were found, one on an island nearby and one on Nantasket Beach in Hull. It's another one of the most famous tragedies in American lighthouse history. There's a drawing of the lighthouse falling over. And but the good news is they built this beautiful new lighthouse. Took 5 years to build, 1855 to 60. I could go on about the building of it, but we don't have time for that. So it went into service in 1860, and there's some drawings from a newspaper article showing life at the lighthouse. And what I want to tell you about is something that was written by a writer in the late 1800s named Gustav Kobe, K-O-B-B-E, with an accent over the E. He was best known as a music critic, and he traveled to the lighthouse in 1893 aboard the lighthouse tender Geranium, and he wrote an article for the Century magazine. And I'm going to read you a quote from Kobe's article. He said, quote, "For there have been keepers of the present tower who have affirmed that one of those who perished with the old lighthouse haunts the spot. Strange noises have been heard in the oil room, sudden rattling of cans and clinking of glass, as if someone were at work there. Stories are also current of the mysterious filling of the lamp and cleaning of the lens and lantern. One night, as the midnight watch was drawing to a close, the keeper in the watchroom, who had been brooding over the destruction of the old tower, quite unconsciously leaned forward and rapped with his pipe. A few minutes later, he was startled to hear an answering rap from below." Unquote. So the other keeper was summoned by a bell, and he said that he hadn't heard any rapping. But it was said that the keepers in that first lighthouse, where they had the 2 floors of accommodations at the top, those keepers would communicate between floors by rapping on a stovepipe. So some people think that's what these later keepers were hearing, kind of an echo of that. And also legend claims that to this day, in dark and stormy weather, sailors hear a voice coming from the tower crying in Portuguese, which was Joseph Antoine's nationality, "Keep away." Not sure what that is in Portuguese. According to one keeper, many Portuguese fishermen studiously avoided coming close to the lighthouse. So I haven't heard any recent stories, but nobody's lived out there since 1947. It's now privately owned, and I've met the owner, so I'll see if he comes up with any ghost stories. And of course, those of you who live in Scituate, lighthouse buffs all over pretty much know about Scituate Lighthouse, which was built in 1811, went into service in early 1812. And there's a very famous story about it. The first keeper was named Simeon Bates, and he had two daughters, Abigail and Rebecca. And one day, Simeon was away from the lighthouse. He had left his daughters in charge. Some versions of the story refer to them as little girls, but they were 17 and 21 at the time the story takes place. This was 1814, and it was during the War of 1812. So these two young women are in charge at the lighthouse by themselves, and they saw a British warship coming into Scituate Harbor. Of course, the British did a lot of damage along the coast at that time. And they saw this warship coming in, and they saw some of the men loading onto a smaller boat to come ashore. And they thought quickly, they grabbed their fife and drum, which they played for fun, and they started playing Yankee Doodle. They were out of sight from the approaching British. So the British heard the fife and drum playing Yankee Doodle, and they thought it was the militia approaching, and they turned around and left the harbor. That's a pretty famous story, the Lighthouse Army of Two. But some people think the ghosts of Abigail and Rebecca still haunt the place. And supposedly the fife and drum music can be heard sometimes, and there's been other things said. I'm sure some of you know Bob Gallagher, who's lived there for a long time now, the caretaker, and he's a teacher. He hasn't told me any ghost stories. But anyway, this picture was taken in 1967. It's a Polaroid picture, and it was in a newspaper article that said it must be a ghost. The person who took it was kind of shocked by what he got, but I don't know, it's not a very good picture. Could be something, kind of a quirk or a glitch with the camera or the film or something. Pretty hard to say, but it's interesting for sure. It looks like that flash is right in front of the lighthouse. So I don't know the explanation for it. One more film clip. This is from the recent movie, The Lighthouse, from last year, which people mostly either seem to love or hate. I'm actually one of the ones who loves it, but it's a very weird movie. It's not for everyone by any means, but it's set at a Maine lighthouse in the early 1900s with two keepers who kind of turn against each other. But there's a lot of other weird elements, kind of supernatural. It's kind of a horror movie. I'm not sure I completely understood it, but I liked it. But anyway, let me just play you a brief clip.
How long have we been on this rock? 5 weeks? 2 days? Help me to recollect.
If there's any movie that ever utilized the dark side of lighthouses, it's that one. So I got one more lighthouse to tell you about. This is my home base. I'm here in Portsmouth, and this lighthouse is about 10 minutes from where I'm sitting. It's in Newcastle, little town next to Portsmouth. It's Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse. The light station there was the first one north of Boston, established in June of 1771. It's been rebuilt a couple of times. This lighthouse was built in 1878. It's next to Fort Constitution. You can see the Civil War era wall there. The fort has tremendous history, and it's all on a Coast Guard station, an active Coast Guard station. The longest serving keeper of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse was this man, Joshua Card, who was there for 35 years, 1874 to 1909. He was a local man and went to sea as a kid, basically. And after years at sea, he worked at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. He ran a stagecoach line between Newcastle and Portsmouth for a while. And then he became a lighthouse keeper in his 40s, and he eventually got the job at Portsmouth Harbor in 1874. And they say he was extremely well liked. He knew all the history of the area, loved to show visitors around his lighthouse. In both of these pictures, he's wearing the old lighthouse service uniform. In the picture on the left here, you don't see anything on the lapels, and it's a little hard to see on the right. But usually that uniform would have the letter K on the lapels that signified principal keeper. And they say that if he was showing people around and they asked him what the K stood for, he would always tell them it stood for captain. And that's important because I'm going to refer back to it in a few minutes. But he was keeper until he was 86 years old, and he had a stroke and he had to retire. And he was believed to be the oldest lighthouse keeper in the country at that time. He died 2 years later in 1911. The last keeper of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse was Elson Small. You see here with his wife Connie in those two pictures. And they had a 28-year career at lighthouses. This was their last station. Before they went to Portsmouth Harbor, they had only been on islands off the Maine coast, so they didn't get electricity until they came here in 1946. So I got to know Connie late in her life. She wrote a book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife when she was 85 years old. It's a great book. I recommend it really highly, The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. And when she was 101, she's 101 on that picture on the right. We gave her a certificate as the honorary chairperson of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse. That's me with Joanne and Paul, two of our volunteers. And we called her our guiding light. And I was, really privileged to know her. She was just a wonderful, optimistic, really nice person who loved, skipping ahead too fast, who loved knowing that people were taking care of lighthouses. So I'm going to refer back to her shortly. I just wanted to lay the scene here. So when I founded Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse originally, then later we started taking care of another lighthouse and made it Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. I founded the group in 2001 as a chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation. And soon after that, I started hearing stories from the Coast Guard about strange things happening there because they're there 24 hours a day. And one thing I kept hearing was that the person on watch in their watchtower on the main building around 2 or 3 a.m. would hear footsteps coming up the middle stairs. They would check and nobody was there. They would see a woman walking on the seawall near the main building, and they would check and nobody was there. One night, a guy was out doing the rounds, and he went over near what used to be the keeper's house, and he said there was a man standing in front of it, and he went closer. He was about to say, what are you doing there? And the man disappeared. And also, a few people told me that they would be working in the first floor of the keeper's house, and they would hear footsteps on the second floor above them, even though nobody was there. Actually, that's the first story I heard. One woman told me that. She was kind of shaken up by it. She couldn't figure it out. So these stories were kind of mounting. And one of our volunteers called in New England Ghost Project in 2005. And so that's when I first met them. There's Ron Kolek and Maureen Wood and Karen Mossy at the top of the stairs in the lighthouse during that first investigation. And first I'm going to play you a couple of EVPs. First one was recorded by Karen at the top of the stairs after midnight, and you're going to hear her ask, "Who's there?" And she seems to get an answer. This one's a little soft, so I'm going to turn it up. It's definitely not a Class A EVP. It's probably a Class B or even worse, but I'll play it again. Karen believes that the voice is saying captain or the captain really quickly. I don't know for sure, but that's why I told you the story of Joshua Card, that he liked being called captain. Is this him? Is this his voice? I have no idea. I should mention that I'm one of a few people who's heard an audible voice inside the lighthouse that I can't explain. One afternoon a few years ago, actually it was more than a few years ago, it was more than 10 years ago now. I was giving a tour early in the afternoon for a young couple. And as I'm talking, I heard a voice say, "Hello," kind of like that. And I stopped talking and I said to them, "Did you hear something?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I heard a man say hello." His wife didn't hear anything. And it sounded like it was just a few feet to my right at the top of the stairs. We're standing in what's called the watch room at the top of the stairs, and there was a wall blocking the view of the stairs from me. So I looked around and looked down the stairs and nobody was there. We looked outside, there was nobody there. There was nobody around at all, anywhere near the lighthouse. So that was pretty weird. My wife has heard a voice when she was there alone in the watch room taking decorations down, but she couldn't make out what it said, but she was sure it was like right in her ear from behind her, she said. And one of her volunteers, Ross, was up in the lantern one day, lantern room, painting the walls. And he heard a voice say, "What are you doing?" So he decided it was time to go home at that point. So, and people have also seen what they say is a keeper in a uniform standing outside the lighthouse there. So this is from a later investigation, and you're going to hear Ron Kolek's voice. He was at the top of the lighthouse standing out in the deck. I think it was 2 a.m. And he asked, "Do you like us being here?" And he seems to get a response to that.
Do you like us being here? Do you like us being here?
Sure sounds like yes to me. I've played this a couple of times for people where they thought it sounded like no, but it sounds like yes to me. And this is Jim Stonier, who is the EVP expert for New England Ghost Project now. And this was right after that one you just heard. And you're going to hear Jim ask or say, "I think you should check the light," and he gets a response to it.
I think you should check the light.
Sounds like okay to me, and it always strikes me funny because there's that pause there. It's like I imagine Joshua Card is napping, and when he hears "I think you should check the light," and he wakes up and says, "Okay."
I think you should check the light.
And it's interesting that a lot of these EVPs seem to sound like kind of a gruff male voice, very similar to what I heard when I heard that hello at the top of the stairs. So it's kind of interesting how it fits. It sounds very similar.
I think you should check the light.
That's enough of that. And here's an EVP recorded by a different group, Sauhegan Paranormal, out of Nashua, New Hampshire, in 2010. And I was there with them. You're going to hear a conversation going on the second floor of the keeper's house. And one of the women talking heard something weird. So we're discussing, what could that be? And I say something about, I scratched my head. Did you hear that? And right after I say that, you're going to hear a weird high-pitched voice. And they believe that the voice is saying, "Mary, Mary." So let me play this.
What was that noise?
I heard it. My camera is closing.
No, it didn't come from your camera.
I scratched my head. You didn't hear that?
No, that's right. It was more like a high-pitched.
Does your camera make a high-pitched noise when it shuts?
Here, I'll set it for you.
So I hope you could hear that. I don't know what it means, but I will tell you that there was a longtime keeper, Henry Cuskley, was there for 26 years. His wife was named Mary. Her father was a previous keeper who died in the keeper's house, and her mother, the keeper's wife, also died in the keeper's house. So some people have theorized that this voice is the mother of Mary crying out for Mary there. So Fort Constitution, as I mentioned, is right next to the lighthouse. There's never been a battle there to speak of, but there was an explosion, an accidental explosion that happened on the 4th of July in 1809. Soldiers were getting ready to fire a salute, and they put some gunpowder out on the ground to dry, and somehow it got ignited. And there was a huge explosion that instantly killed 8 people. At least 2 more died later. Well, 2 more died later, but we don't know for sure how many died in the first place. We think it was 8. It might have been 9. There was a woman seen on the seawall just before the explosion. She was never seen again. Only a little bit of her dress was found, but nobody identified who she was. So probably 11 people died altogether. And a lot of people have had unusual experiences in the fort that are usually chalked up to that explosion. And there's been a lot of people who just felt a presence there, and feeling a hand on the back of their neck has happened a number of times. So these 2 pictures were taken during our first nighttime event about, over 10 years ago now. And it was about 11 o'clock at night. And this woman, Veronica Pollock, took a picture from inside both these pictures from inside the fort, looking out at the grounds of the Coast Guard station. Nothing was going on in the Coast Guard station at all. It's completely dark and silent. And, you know, I don't know what these pictures are, what she captured here. They're very interesting. And you can make your own conclusions. I showed these to a digital photography expert who could come up with no explanation for them whatsoever, completely skeptical of the paranormal. So he didn't think they were paranormal, but he couldn't explain them. Ghost Hunters did a show here at the Fort and Lighthouse about 12 years ago, and they showed one of these pictures, although they had her describing the other one, so they showed the wrong picture. This is another investigation by Seguin Paranormal in 2011, and the woman standing there said that she felt something on the back of her neck. Seconds after she said that, somebody else in the group took this picture, and it sure looks like, sure looks like something right behind her neck there, and almost like there's something reaching out from that larger shape touching her neck. So that's pretty interesting, I think. Several years ago, I did this talk for a paranormal event, and this guy, an author from England, who was supposed to be a big paranormal expert, said, please keep that on the screen for a few minutes. And he got up and he's looking at it really intently, and he said, that's a moth. He said a moth flew in front of the camera lens when the picture was taken, and that's what that is. And my reaction is, well, yeah, maybe, but isn't that still incredible? If seconds after this woman said, I feel something touching the back of my neck, that a moth flew in front of the camera and caused this image to happen? No matter how you look at it, it's incredible that, you know, this came right after she said that. So I'm almost done here. This is Connie Small again, author of The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, wife of the last keeper at Portsmouth Harbor Light. And she's holding the certificate we gave her as our honorary chairperson. So she died at 103 in February 2005. 6 months later, or 5 months later, we had the first investigation by New England Ghost Project. No, 6 months later, it was August 2005. So New England Ghost Project came and did their investigation. And about 12:30 a.m., we're all up on the second floor of the keeper's house in a little kitchen area. And Maureen Wood is standing there, and she said, oh, there's a strong presence here. And then right after she said that, she started speaking as if she was an old woman. And she said, I want to thank someone. And Ron Kolick is standing next to her. He said, is it me? And she said, no. And he said, is it Jeremy? And she said, yes. And she didn't say a whole lot more. She said, I want to thank you for the gift. And as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, well, it actually kind of sounds like Connie's voice, but it's not. And, you know, the skeptic in me was thinking, you know, it's silly to even think that. But another part of me thought that it felt like Connie was there. So after just a minute or two of this channeling, or whatever you want to call it, Maureen fell on the floor, which she often does. The theory is that there's a moment there when the spirit leaves before Maureen's kind of in charge of her body again. It's like nobody is in charge, so sometimes she just falls on the floor. So she went down like a ton of bricks, but she was okay. People helped her up, and they helped her down to the first floor. But I was sitting there by myself for a little while longer. But then our volunteer, Rocky, came back upstairs, and she was kind of shaken up. And she said, you won't believe what Maureen just told me. And she said that Maureen had told her, Connie wants to thank you for the big pink flowers. Now, at Connie's funeral 6 months earlier, Roxy and her husband were the last people to leave the church. It was an open casket. They went up to the casket. Roxy had a bouquet of pink tulips, along with a special lighthouse card she had made in with the tulips. And the minister said, if you want to put that in the casket, go ahead. So Roxy put the flowers in the casket. Nobody knew that except her husband and the minister. 6 months later, Maureen, who had never heard of Connie, never heard or met any of us, out of the blue said to Roxy, Connie wants to thank you for the big pink flowers. So that was pretty interesting. And a few minutes later, Maureen actually said to me and Roxy together, Connie wants to thank you for being at her funeral. That was interesting too. So here are some sources of information. You heard about my website earlier, U.S. Lighthouse Society, American Lighthouse Foundation, New England Ghost Project. Ron and company do various events. They're doing some, events along these lines, like Zoom events these days. You might want to check that out. And Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. And that brings me to the end. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome here. Let me get out of sharing here. So I'm back here. And I do have that one more story that was emailed to me just yesterday that I think is really interesting. I would actually read the email to you if people want to hear it. Do you want to hear one more lighthouse ghost story?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
You can grab the hook if I'm going too long, get the hook out. But there's a lighthouse. There was a lighthouse in Alaska called Scotch Cap, and it was destroyed by a tsunami of course, I should have looked at the date before I started saying this. I think it was 1941. But there was an earthquake, caused a tsunami, wiped out the lighthouse. 5 keepers died. The second worst lighthouse tragedy in American history, the one at Boston Light. Anyway, this guy, Peter Kaufman, is writing a book about that disaster. And here's what he said. He said that he heard this from a guy who was a keeper both at Scotch Cap and at Cape Sarashef, which is also in Alaska. And I think this story that he describes was at Scotch Cap before the disaster. And the guy told him, quote, they all believed the place, Scotch Cap, was haunted because there were no keepers there after the disaster. So this has to be before that. They all believed the place was haunted. They were absolutely convinced. When I spent the night there and was talking with the guys at Scotch, they would tell stories about why they were just convinced it was oh no, okay. I'm a little confused about the timing of this. It's still a good story in any case, but they were convinced it was the ones who were killed. You know what I think it is? There was like a radio communications center there too, and there were Coast Guard there. So I think he's talking about the guys there. In any case, so they're convinced that the ones who were killed were haunting the place. So the story continues. One guy's on watch. From the watchstanders area, it's kind of a glassed-in thing. There was a hallway where you could see down. It went down past the motor generator room. Now, everybody wore civilian clothes. Over at Cape Sarashef, I sometimes wore dungarees and shirts and stuff like that. If we wanted to wear civilian clothes, we wore civilian clothes. If we wanted to grow a beard, we grew a beard. Nobody really got on us, especially at Scotch Cap. Everybody wore civilian clothes. Anyway, this guy said he saw somebody walking down the hall and he didn't recognize the civilian clothes that this guy was wearing. So he called out to him. The person looked back at him and then walked into the engine room, the motor generator room. He wondered, well, who is that? So he walked down there and went into the motor generator room just as the motor generator went offline. He thought that this ghost or whatever it was warning him, telling him, you need to get down here because your motor generator is getting ready to go out. So that's that story. I'll tell you one more story that was told to me that was unsolicited. I was talking to an ex-lighthouse keeper in Newfoundland probably 10 years ago. And I'm about to hang up with him. And he said, you want to hear my ghost story? And I said, sure. And he said that one night his wife was very sick. He was taking care of her. It's about 2 a.m. He's up in their bedroom upstairs. He looked out towards the rocks by the lighthouse and he said, a large vessel all lit up about to run into the rocks. So he ran downstairs, went out on the rocks, and he's waving his arms, trying to keep the vessel away. But then he realized there's nothing there. There's no ship, no nothing. And he told me he knew that he saw that. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't his imagination. He knew that he saw it. So he feels like he saw a ghost ship. He said it looks a lot like the ferry that goes by there during the day, but it never would go by at 2 a.m. So that was another interesting story that I didn't ask for, but I got. So I'll shut up now and see. I don't know if we have time for any questions or anything. Jean, you still there? All I see is your still picture. I don't see.
I'm here.
There,
yes.
There you are. You were hiding there for a while.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. This was wonderful. And yes, we have plenty of time for questions.
Okay.
So if anybody's got one you'd like to ask, please go right ahead.
That was awesome.
I enjoyed it. That was very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions?
Anyone have a question?
Or does anybody have any ghost stories they want to tell us?
Ooh.
No?
I
No
think you
questions?
took care of everything.
I guess I covered everything there is to cover. Actually,
Yep.
there's more Lighthouse I could talk about. Oh, somebody's asking a question in the chat. Let me answer that. What is the name of the podcast? It's Lighthearted. It's 2 words, light, L-I-G-H-T, space, hearted, referring to people who have lighthouses in their hearts. If you go to news.uslhs.org, news.uslhs.org. That's like a news blog, and all the podcast episodes are in there. Or if you have like a podcast app on a smartphone and just put in Lighthearted, you'll find it very easily. What we did apparently. Yes.
Jeremy, do you have any stories about Rose Island Light off of Newport?
Yeah. I've actually spent 2 nights there, and I was there with New England Ghost Project for an overnight investigation. There's not a lot of stories going back real far as I can tell, as far as ghost stories, but I'll tell you that I was very friendly with Charlotte Johnson, who was the moving force in restoring that place years ago, and became good friends with her successor, Dave McCurdy, who was there for some years as the director. And he and his wife would sometimes sleep in the upstairs apartment there, and they felt sure it was haunted. They would hear doors opening and closing and different things when nobody else was there. So they were sure about it. So Dave was there when we had New England Ghost Project there. And I'll just mention, without spending too much time talking about it, that during that investigation, we had, it was a fairly big group involved that night. We had about 6 people sitting around this big, heavy wooden table in the kitchen on the 2nd floor of Rose Island. Rose Island Lighthouse is all one building, the light mounted on the roof. And we're up on the 2nd floor. And we did what's called table tipping, which is an old kind of spiritualist thing where people sit around the table with their fingertips on the table. And Ron said, if there are any spirits here, let us know by making the table move, as long as you mean us no harm. So we're sitting there, and after a few minutes, you could feel like a tingling in your fingers. It felt like almost like electricity. And then after a few more minutes, that big, giant, heavy oak table started to move like rock. And after a few more minutes, it was going ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. I wouldn't believe it if I wasn't there. So that's the most interesting story I have about Rose Island.
And thank you for your help with the Curtis family research on, he was a lighthouse keeper.
Yeah.
1800s. You helped me out on that story. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, he was one of the most famous keepers there for sure. Thank you.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
You're very welcome. Thank you for saying that. So I don't know if anybody
else? Any other questions or stories or Nicole seems to have put something in the chat, Jeremy.
She says, well, it's not a question. She says, we did a paranormal investigation at Fort. I've never been sure how to pronounce the name of that. I know the lighthouse, but if I say Gradio, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. But I don't know if Nicole is still here, but we'd like to, maybe if you want to say a little bit about it, please do. There's Nicole. How did that go? And tell me how to pronounce the name of the lighthouse. Whoop, you have to unmute. Gratiot. Okay, I should know it'd be the last thing I would expect.
Which my last name is Grashik, which is very close to it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but my mom, who's on also, she's around there somewhere. We were hesitant to sign up because it's a little out of our comfort area, but we were able to stay the night there if you did the investigation. And it was a fundraiser, so there was a lot of very interesting, unexplainable things.
Yeah. What was the most interesting, unexplainable thing?
Just at one point, I mean, my mom's on here, but she felt something cold along the back of her neck, and we were in the old hospital on the campus, and they would do turn the flashlights on and off, and it was on a table by itself. So it's pretty weird.
That's actually a common tool that a lot of these groups use, is the flashlight. They'll set it so that it's not quite connecting, so that it's borderline, like unscrew it a little bit. So I'm sure you saw that. So it's not quite all on or all off, but they'll put it down and ask questions and say like 1 flash is yes and 2 flashes is no, that type of thing. And I mostly don't believe in it, but one time at Rose Island in the fog signal building, we tried it, and there were like 10 questions in a row where it just seemed like it was answering. The second we would ask the question, it would answer yes or no, and all the answers seemed to make sense. So that was the one time where I started to actually believe in that. So I have an open mind. I'm an open-minded skeptic. Thank you, Nicole. Gratiot, which is in Michigan for people who don't know.
Right. Well, Jeremy, thank you very much for this. It was very, very interesting, and it really piqued my interest. I'm into that whole, paranormal and the investigators and all that stuff. So I absolutely loved it, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We won't be back again for almost another month. We're coming back on December 10th. And we'll have Sal St. George will be our presenter, and he will be doing the history and the making of the classic It's a Wonderful Life. So we're really looking forward to that. And Jeremy, we hope you'll come back again, maybe not Zoom, maybe we can do it live next time.
I hope so. Yeah.
I hope so. But Zoom is great. We see, look at this, we've got people from all over the country, which is fabulous.
Yeah. Even after all this crazy pandemic and everything is over, I think Zoom it serves a good purpose, to bring people together from all over. It is really good. So thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
It certainly does. Yes, thank you as well. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, we don't charge anything for this, but if you feel moved to, we would gladly take your donations. We do PayPal. You can mail a check. And please join us again for our next presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yep. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.